Hello everybody and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast in association with eBay Motors Group. It is Saturday the 20th of March and you're joined by myself, Philip Northard.
And me, Curtis Hutchinson. This is episode 13, season 7 of Motor Trade Radio, bringing you all the chatter that matters. And once again, we've gathered together this week's big industry stories across the franchise and independent sectors for you to enjoy all in one place on your podcast feed.
So, I mean, what a week, Curtis, for headlines. I mean, announcements and things going on. And have you seen any more new plates, March plates on the road near you? Have you been out and about?
I have been out and about, but I haven't seen any more new 21 plates, but I'm sure they're out there somewhere.
Yeah, it's that time of the month now where it's, we're approaching, I hate to call it an anniversary because it gives the wrong tone, doesn't it? But we're approaching that 23rd of March where the UK went into lockdown, and obviously from our perspective the showroom shut on the 23rd, and that's the point of change now when we're looking at these year-on-year analysis stats and numbers as to what they look like compared to last year, because last year sort of stopped on the 23rd, didn't it?
Yeah, you're right. This is when year-on-year comparisons will start having a bit of context, which we haven't really had up until now. So, let's see how that one pans out.
The balance switches a little bit, doesn't it? It starts to swing a little bit because as we've spoke about on today's podcast and previously with Mike and others, that there is activity taking place across the sector at a certain, not 100%, but at sort of 60, 70, 80%. And that looks like we'll continue through the end of the month, whereas last year it stopped. So again, it'll be see where that swing changes now from now on. But what a week!
Yeah, what a week, and we've had a bit of a rebrand, haven't we?
We have, yeah. I think we felt it was time, didn't we, that we bit of a refresh of the visuals and our social presence as well. It's been how many years do we say? Well, I think it says it right at the start of the show there, Curtis.
7 years.
Seven years with 7 seasons and 13 episodes. Kind of says it all, doesn't it? So I think it was time for a bit of a refresh now between us.
Yeah, so we followed in the tracks of Peugeot, Kia and Renault with a brand new logo, and we'll have a shout out for the designer Luke Hancock, who came up with the design, and for services above and beyond the call of duty, because he was getting briefs from you, he was getting briefs from me, and he came up with something that we both liked. Yeah, no, I mean he's been a great help as Luke, and hopefully he's listening to the show this morning. That's great work, Luke, and thanks for the effort. And I know you thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm sure that's what you told us anyway. I'm sure you might go away when Curtis and I were debating certain areas of it. But thank you, and huge shout out and thanks again. But because we've got a new logo, it means we've been able to refresh our social media channels. So do head over to Twitter and Facebook, and do join our LinkedIn group. So you know where to find us there. Yeah, lots going on in there, and hopefully you'll start to listen to the podcast through any of those channels and download it. So we've also got another announcement, haven't we, Curtis? Yeah, is that the email address? It is this. It is. Oh, great. Thanks. Yes, if you want to contact us at all, we have a dedicated email address now, which is motortraderadio@yahoo.com. So if you've got any questions for Phil or I, or if you've got any suggestions, or if you'd like to come on the show, drop us an email and we'll take a look and get back to you. Yeah. So the big news of the week, really, on top of everything else that's going on, is we are now approaching the showrooms reopening, and we mentioned on last week's show with people such as Govt, who's putting out his social images on a daily basis as we count down towards the 12th of April here in England, but Scotland has an earlier reopening, which they're opening on the 5th of April, and we've got a bit of a
I think we've not heard from Northern Ireland and Wales, but it's based on the fact that we've not heard anything, that they are following England and remaining with the 12th. I don't know. I think that's where we are at the minute.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and we will look at the Scotland reopening. We've got a headline on that, but obviously good news for Scotland, and England not far behind. Also this week we've got an exclusive interview with Louise Wallace, who is the head of business management at the Nfda, and she'll be talking about the newly published winter 2020-2021 Nfda dealer attitude survey. So this is the twice yearly barometer of exactly what dealers think of their car brand partners. So do stay tuned for that.
I'm glad you said that one, Curtis. 2020, there's a lot of 20s in there, aren't there?
Yeah, that's actually incredibly difficult to say.
You weren't expecting that one like that.
No, it looked fairly straightforward on the page.
But we have selected some of the best headlines in our opinion this week, haven't we? And we've got a nice little "and finally," which I've not seen it anywhere else really. So I don't think anyone's picked up on this week's "and finally" either.
No, a first for us. So headlines this week, we've got the reaction to dealerships reopening in Scotland, how a DVLA strike could impact car dealers. We'll take a look at the government's controversial decision to cut the plug-in grant. MOT tests to slump in April following last year's COVID extension. We've got another acquisition. This time it's from Virtue. And as you say, and finally, and a little teaser for that, which F1 world champion ended up on a speed awareness course.
Exactly. So, as we've been talking about there at the start of the show, we're going first over to Car Dealer. And Scottish dealers prepare for record month as First Minister announces showrooms will open on the 5th of April. So there is a lot going up in Scotland at the minute, but it is sticking with automotive, and it is good news for the automotive sector as Nicola Sturgeon has announced earlier in the week that car showrooms can open again for physical customers rather than click and collect, and that happens on the 5th of April. And there's a few different responses on reactions to this, weren't there, from those in Car Dealer Mag, but also we've got a slightly different view from those in AM.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. The Car Dealer magazine spoke to a number of dealers, and the reaction very, very positive. AM did the same, and the response was more measured. But starting with the Car Dealer's story, Peter Vardy is quoted as being over the moon with the announcement, and they're now working towards a record April. David Wishart, director of Frasers of Falkirk, was also upbeat and optimistic about the news, saying he also believed April would be a particularly good month for sales. And he was quoted as saying, "I expect we'll see a huge upturn in sales once the shackles have been taken off."
So yeah, again, they say, and a slightly different view with those that AM have quoted, that they're taking a little bit more of a pragmatic view towards it. And I suppose really with this, it's a case of, it's the reaction to it, isn't it, and how they're going to open again on the 5th and what they expect once those showrooms do reopen on the 5th of April.
Yeah, so over at AM, Arnold Clark's CEO, Eddie Hawthorne, he's saying that the business had been performing very well during March, but suggested the market strength may not fully return until May, when free movement is once again permitted in Scotland. And he makes a good point in the story that within Scotland, most car buyers need to travel a fair distance to get to a dealership, so they are looking beyond April and May, when the restrictions are lifted even more. And the SMTA chairman Sandy Burgess also agreed that there was unlikely to be a sudden surge of consumer demand, though obviously he's welcomed the timeline for the reopening.
Yeah, and I think that there is points in both, really. I mean, there's, I think a view at the minute generally is we do expect an upsurge in activity, but not maybe to the levels that some may be thinking, where that's in England on the 12th or up in Scotland on the 5th of April, that there are still travel restrictions in place and other things taking place. So again, like you say, quite an interesting view there in AM from Eddie Hawthorne and Sandy Burgess there about the distance travelled, because it's not, although sort of geographically there isn't a lot of distance between the two, but to actually get there is a slightly different thing entirely.
Yes, yeah. And staying with AM Online, the headline is DVLA workers' COVID prompted strike action, bad timing for recovering car dealers. So this is strike action proposed by employees at DVLA's base in Swansea, and that could impact the car retail sector's own recovery. And this is a story that you picked up on, because you're quoted within this, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the mid-month review that I do, and really it was trying to call it out that there's two things with this one, and to put this in context, there's a humanitarian view of this, with the fact that within the DVLA, within Swansea, there is a close proximity of working environment in the offices, and they've got 6,000 staff that work at those offices, and I think early days of the pandemic, mid last year, that there were cases and heavy cases of COVID because of that working environment. Now, I think there was reports coming out from the BBC that there was threats of strike action due to the lack of sort of measures in place, and that they were having to go into those offices and work. But the DVLA have responded saying that they haven't had that many cases of full COVID. But I think you and I said before we started recording the show, I think that, still a significant number of COVID cases, isn't there, in a short period of time?
Yeah, according to the AM coverage, it's 500 COVID cases since September. And I guess as far as dealers are concerned, the potential impact is the whole registration process, plate transfers and V5s. What will happen if the workers there are actually on strike?
Yeah, and I mean, these days, and those listening to the podcast this morning will know that the paperwork reliance on the DVLA is reduced now, because a lot of the activity does take place in the online environment through registration of vehicles, etc., and taxation of vehicles. But there is a huge reliance, and we saw this right at the start of the pandemic when everything went into lockdown, and some of the dealers were still trying to do some kind of activity. And on the 1st of June, when dealers opened up again, there were reports of sort of 8 to 10 week delays on paperwork for plate transfers and other change of ownership, change of names on things like V5s, etc., that were just taking so long because they were reliant on the postal service and the manual processes taking place at the DVLA. And I think the point of this story is that with everything else that the retail sector is facing, and the fact that when they do reopen on whatever date that is, whether it's the 5th or the 12th of April, there's a lot that they're going to need to do, and they're going to have to focus on recovery and replenishing some of the lost sales and lost profitability that they've lost through the pandemic. And the last thing they need is delays of paperwork and customers upset that things can't be done as efficiently and as quickly. So I think there's two sides to this. Like I say, there's the challenge to the sector and something that the dealers and the retailers don't need at this point in time, but also the feeling towards the staff down at Swansea, because there's a humanitarian side of this that you can understand the feeling and why they do feel the way they do with that level of COVID cases that they've felt down there. So let's hope that everything gets sorted out and we don't see any challenges for the dealer sector once they do reopen.
So heading over to Autocar, and I guess this was a particularly big story. It got a lot of coverage over the course of the week, and it's government cuts electric car grant from £3,000 to £2,500. So this is the government downsizing the financial incentive package offered to buyers of EVs and reducing the car grants, the plug-in grants, down to £2,500. But also lowering the upper price limit for eligible vehicles from £50,000 to £35,000. And there's a couple of elements to this story because it came out of nowhere. I don't think there was any talk of this happening. It was announced suddenly and implemented immediately. But the timing, midway through a plate change month, couldn't really have been couldn't have come at a worse time, could it?
No, and I think there's I mean, Autocar have picked up on it. I mean, Mike Hawes, as from the SMMT, who we've had on the podcast, has reacted to it. I think he sums it up quite well, doesn't he? I mean, he's put the wrong move at the wrong time.
Yeah.
And it is as simple as that. Again, probably relating to the last story. There's enough going on within the sector that was the need for this. And you kind of can understand it from a treasury perspective, but actually, with the focus on the EV sector, with the focus on the dealer market reopening and things like this, the challenges that we're all facing, you don't need this. I think there's accusations that the government haven't liaised with the sector. They haven't taken guidance on this from those in the sector, and they've come up with this measure. And I think the headlines are focused towards Tesla because of the price of the Tesla, but it does hit quite a few vehicles, doesn't it? Actually, this reduction down to the £35,000 bracket.
Yeah, you're right. It's been estimated that it'll affect around 20 models, but looking at the pricing of a lot of these models, there's quite a few that are pitched between £35,000 and £36,000. So they will all be affected. So they will no longer be eligible. I've done some digging around because it wasn't immediately clear when this announcement was made as to when it would come into effect. So orders that were already in place where grants had been applied for are actually exempt. So it was, it's been placed on all new orders from the middle of the week. But I couldn't help thinking that a better move would have been to, keep the £3,000 grant, but restrict it to vehicles up to £35,000 and introduce it at the end of April to enable buyers and dealers to actually prepare for it. And why just spring that on the market all of a sudden without any fanfare? And effectively, because some of these buyers potentially won't buy electric now. They may go back to petrol or diesel.
And I think there's two things. I mean, on the back of what you're saying there in terms of the government, I mean, it's been proven many times over, and those, again, listening to the podcast this morning are probably shouting, going, do you remember this and do you remember that? I mean, they have a history of introducing changes that have a severe impact on the sector at the wrong time. The VED changes and WLTP and RDE, there's all these legislations and regulations that enter the sector, and they come in at such ridiculous times that have a severe impact on the sector. And normally, at the end of a new plate month, or just before, depending on what it is, it just creates such challenges for the sector to get the head around it. And I think one of the things that I'm looking at trying to sort of clear up on this, and I know we were talking about it earlier, Curtis, that I haven't seen, and I'm taking it on the assumption that the 35,000 is the P11D value, because that is only the value that the government can measure. But actually, what about if you're buying a £34,000 vehicle and the options of the roof or the wheels or whatever you add onto it take you over that 35,000 benchmark? That all of a sudden it's going to change a lot of things in the sector. We saw that with the VED around the £40,000 bracket taxation, didn't we, back a few years ago, and the impact that had. So again, clear demonstration that the government just either don't listen to the sector or they don't understand the sector well enough before they put these measures in place.
Yeah, and you know what? Part of me thinks that because they've announced that 2030 is the year when new ICE cars will no longer be sold, people now need to make that decision as to, when they buy their next car, will it be plug-in hybrid, will it be petrol, will it be EV? So it's a bit more stick, and they've taken away the carrot.
Yeah. I mean, in a time where, everything that's going on, all the webinars, all the forums around electric vehicles, all the conversation that's taking place around the realistic achievement of reaching the 2030 deadline, everything that's going on, you don't need these, do you? You don't need these sort of drop in initiatives or changes to initiatives that actually don't help that move, that road to zero, as the government put it, in terms of that 2030 deadline. So I don't know, it's not being taken well, as it, this week when that was announced.
You're listening to All the Chatter That Matters on the Motor Trade Radio podcast, brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. This is your weekly one-stop shop for all the biggest car retailing headlines, and available by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you find your favourite podcasts. And now we're going to chat with our special guest, Louise Wallace, Head of Business Development at the Nfda. Welcome back to the Motor Trade Radio podcast, Louise, and for joining us to discuss the newly published winter Nfda Dealer Attitude Survey. This is, of course, the twice-yearly barometer polling the views of franchise dealers on the car and van brands they represent. So welcome back to the podcast, Louise.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
So again, as always, Louise, great to catch up with you and obviously get you back on the podcast, and we'd like to have you on a regular basis, and I'm sure we can get you back on again in the future. But we are looking at sort of the new winter survey. So do you want to start off with tell us a little bit about the survey, which was the first launched back in 1989 now, which seems a long way ago, but how it is compiled and what sort of feedback do you get and from the groups and the OEMs when it's published?
Yes, we've been running this survey now for over 30 years. It has a fantastic response from both the manufacturers and dealers. It's eagerly awaited. We get calls from dealers and manufacturers way before it's due to be published to ask when it's going to be published and can they have the results as soon as possible. So, yes, it has a fantastic following. We survey 32 brands these days. It has risen over the years, particularly as we've had new brands come into the marketplace. It has 40 plus questions on a range of topics that cover the manufacturer-dealer relationship. Those questions as a whole generally remain quite stable, but we do change some of the questions to cover topics at the moment. COVID being an obvious example as we are on the current survey. We run the survey twice a year, once in the winter and once in the summer, and broadly we have the same type of response for both surveys, but we do get some seasonality in the response rate. Manufacturer engagement is absolutely fantastic from overall. Some manufacturers are more serious about it than others, and generally the response from manufacturers is extremely strong.
Now, Louise, the winter 2020-2021 survey was conducted in January, and you had an impressive 60% response rate during what was a period of disruption with UK showrooms closed to customers due to the lockdown. With this in mind, how did COVID shape the survey, especially in relation to the specific question on OEM support during the pandemic?
Yeah, the survey's been affected in probably two ways. Firstly, it pushed us once and for all to go online for the survey. Up until last spring, we did the survey very much as a hard copy survey that went out to dealers. And we had to make the very difficult decision last year to take the risk of making it fully online, which actually was a risk well worth taking in the end because we had such a huge increase in the response rate. The other side that has affected it, of course, has been the questions, and we added 3 questions into the survey around the manufacturers' response to COVID and how they've been supporting dealers. And we've had some very good responses to that question, and some very encouraging responses to how much support has actually been out there.
And you're in a position now to compare this survey with the last one where you also had COVID-related questions.
Yes, and broadly, I think the results have remained fairly stable on that, and we've had a good average on it, which is well above the sort of 5 middle score on it, and sort of around 6.4, which has been very encouraging. Some manufacturers, of course, have come out of it better than others, but that's always the case. But yes, it's been good to be able to compare the scores across the year.
So the general feedback from dealers is that they're sort of relatively satisfied with the level of support they're getting.
Yes, generally, and actually I think we've been extremely encouraged by that and how supportive manufacturers have generally been during the pandemic to dealers.
Do you think, Louise, in the world that we've been operating in, majority in the sort of the working from home, the remote working, do you think that has helped the response rate, or do you think now that there has been the engagement with it, that will remain as we go forward?
I think actually bizarrely what's helped the response rate is actually going fully online. I think it was something we procrastinated about changing for many years because we thought we'd lose response rates, but actually that has had increased the engagement. Now it's just dropping into people's inboxes. It's getting responded to as soon as it falls into the inbox, and we're getting a good response rate.
No, I'd agree with that. I think it's now particularly now through the pandemic, I think that sort of that digital space is being sort of embraced a lot more, hasn't it? And I think it's certainly one of them trends that will remain, I think, going forward.
Yeah, I believe so.
So I think drilling into some of the detail, I mean, what did the survey reveal in terms of the current and future return on profit, margin, investment, and how did these results compare to what you found 6 months ago in the last survey?
Well, what was very encouraging is that generally the questions around profitability have actually shown a positive move since the summer. It would appear from the results we're getting that dealers are actually expecting profits to improve coming out of lockdown as well, because the future profit figures were also up. So it was a very encouraging survey in that respect. Of course, we've got quite varied scores across the manufacturers, as you will when you've got 32 manufacturers there. But generally, for most brands, there has been a positive improvement on profit as it stands at the moment, and more importantly, on what they expect profit to be going forward.
Now, one of the big unknowns at the moment, Louise, is just how the new car market will perform following the lifting of the Q1 lockdown. And I guess, once you factor in things like the widely reported supply issues as well, with this in mind, how satisfied are dealers with car maker targets, and are they realistic?
We've got a very average score on targets, it's around 5.3 in the current survey, but it has improved since the winter. So for some manufacturers, I think there's no real concern about targets going into our post-lockdown environment. For others, there is some concern as to whether targets will be met, but that's partly probably because the targets have been set on previous year's figures, which don't necessarily bear out how the year is going to actually turn out. But generally, we're not seeing scores that would be particularly different to pre-lockdown marketplace.
And I think we're moving on a little bit in terms of particularly on the back of this week's news around the grant reduction, but with the sector increasingly focused on the switch to EV vehicles in 2030, and obviously with Nfda leading the EVA proposition to help the dealer network in alignment with the UK government. How satisfied are dealers with that alternative fuel offerings that they're receiving from their OEM partners at the minute, and what the survey, did that reveal any findings?
The average score actually was quite encouraging. It was 6.4, which is well above average. there were some manufacturers who scored extremely well on those questions, and though I will remain nameless and not point fingers, they were the manufacturers where there is good offerings on electric vehicles. The score overall, though, was pulled down by a few manufacturers where the offering isn't as good as it could be at the moment, and dealers are concerned that offering won't meet the demand of customers, which may cause some problems. But generally, overall, the score for the alternative fuel offering actually was encouraging and was very positive.
So I suppose your findings from that is that, that relationship and obviously this strategy towards the 2030 target, there is, engagement from both the OEMs and the dealers then in most cases across the manufacturers.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I think most of the manufacturers are engaging with the dealers. They have the product, and it's a very positive feel from the dealer network. On top of that, there are a number of manufacturers who are doing extremely well in that marketplace at the moment, and the scores show that quite strongly.
And finally, Louise, looking at the average scores across all questions, which provides the headline results of how the individual brands have performed, the average actually increased from 5.9 to 6, with the top 5 brands seeing improvements. Now, on the podcast, we do like a top 5. So if I can just go through the top 5 brands. So number 5, we've got Mini, number 4, Toyota, number 3, Mercedes, number 2, Kia, and number 1, Lexus. So what, in your view, does this tell us about dealer confidence as they prepare to reopen their doors? Because, as I say, that average has gone up over the last 6 months.
I think it reinforces the general positivity with dealers at the moment that actually post-lockdown we could have quite a good year. I think there's a lot of customers out there who are ready to buy but won't buy in a lockdown situation and waiting for showrooms to open. And I think dealers are looking forward to that moment when those customers come back into the showroom and start buying. It would bear out the comments that actually we could see a little bit of boom in the car market over the summer and into the early autumn as consumers who've not been particularly spending over the last 12 months actually decide to spend. And there will be money put aside which hasn't been spent on other things like commuting and stuff like that, and also holidays being a particular instance. And I think even over the summer, people will be looking at how they spend their money, and I think a new car will be high on the agenda, particularly if people are going to start commuting by car rather than by public transport in the short term.
And do you think the manufacturers are, they're behind that? I mean, obviously from my side, looking inwards into this, I mean, it looks, the dates for Scotland with the 5th of April and the dates for England and Wales currently set at the 12th of April. And there's certainly, since those dates have been released, there is an increase in engagement and activity in the public space, isn't there, both from the OEMs and the dealers. Do you think that is the case across all the manufacturers? Do you think there is that pent-up sort of optimism towards sort of activity now getting back up a little bit to normal?
I think so. I think most manufacturers are gearing up to ensure that car sales are good this summer. I think there's a feeling that people have put off buying cars, and the manufacturers are now getting behind that to make sure the supply of vehicles is there to ensure that this is actually a good year. And I think that's been borne out by the dealers who feel that there is a lot of positivity there and a lot of support from the manufacturers to make sure that things happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of them things that when we had Mike Hawes on the podcast recently, the fact that you look at it whether, and we're still waiting to see what the actual result of March is going to be, but for the drop of 30% circa for both Jan and Feb, you look at it, you look at either the drop or the fact that there is activity, there's 70% activity taking place in a lockdown scenario, isn't it? So it's a positive that there has been activity.
Yeah, and I think there are genuinely a lot of people who are not necessarily that keen at the moment to buy a car online, but once the showroom opens, they'll be very keen to go in. and do that deal. March is always, a good time to buy a car. There's a lot of people who will be ready to buy in March. They'll just put that purchase off into April and when the showrooms are open.
No, you're right. I think there's a lot of activity, and we're just fingers crossed that the showroom's open and we stay open and keep that activity going now for the remainder of the year. I think the sector's been hit hard enough. So, no, I mean, all it leaves me to say, Louise, I mean, fantastic as always to have you on the podcast, and we'll continue getting you on as things sort of start to develop through the summer. But I mean, for me, just where can the listeners, if they haven't had a copy, and I'll be surprised if they've not seen it or heard about the survey results, but where can they get a hold of a copy or a site of the survey?
They can get a copy of the glossy that we produce for the survey on the Nfda website, and also they can contact anybody in the Nfda offices, and we can, through our press office, and we can send that out to them.
Fantastic. So again, thanks for joining us, and please do come back when the summer survey is produced, because it'll be great to have you back on and share some of the insight from that survey, and do a little bit of compare and contrast around once the showrooms are open and what the summer survey looks like compared to the winter one. So thanks for coming on, Louise, as always.
Thank you, it was a pleasure.
Thanks, Louise.
Again, Curtis, great interview there with Louise. It's always great to have Louise back on the podcast.
Yes.
and sort of give a little bit of context and background behind the survey that the Nfda do. As Louise said, they do the winter survey and the summer survey, and on top of everything else that they do. But it's great to get some insight from Louise on that, and well done to those manufacturers at the top of the league table again.
Yeah, it was good to get a top 5 in there, and it is a significant piece of research. And certainly when I was editing Motor Trader, we used to look at it very, very closely and reference it. And interestingly, I mean, talking to some of the OEM bosses, some of their targets are actually based on how well they fare in the Nfda survey. So, there are wide-reaching ramifications for the survey and how well the brands do each time.
Yeah, and it's good to hear from Louise that the interest in the survey and response to the survey now from the OEMs, the engagement with it is increasing, and I didn't know it had been going on so long as well. In fairness, I think that was a surprise to me that survey has been going for such a length of time.
Yeah, and a good move to take it online, because it sounds that the response rates have really shot up there.
Exactly. So over to the next story. So another great move on, and we're going over to the Express on this one, and this is again the consequences from decisions taken early days of the pandemic in terms of extending the MOT and allowing the market to defer the MOTs, which again, right decision at the right time, but actually the consequences of that is what's been picked up recently in the Express, and saying that MOT test changes, garage preparing for a significant decline in demand from March. And this is about the volume of that 3-year cycle that is as a result from those peak new plate months, and the consequence of the extension of last March for 6 months, and what that's going to have on sort of a lot of them independent and groups that rely on the revenue from MOTs of those vehicles coming in.
Yeah, so there is a significant decline in MOT work expected from April to June. But of course, this will actually take probably 3 or more years to actually wash through. Once the registrations start coming through from those months, in 3 years' time, eligible for their first MOTs. So this story is based on comments made by Stuart James, who is the chief exec of the Independent Garages Association, and he is warning that there's hard times ahead for garages due to this lack of work. Now, I actually interviewed quite recently Hayley Pells, who's the owner of Avia Autos in Bridgend. This was for a piece in the TPS Insider magazine, and she flagged up the concern in the sector that April is a major concern because of this anticipated drop in MoTs, which she reckoned across the sector would be down possibly up to 40%. And she also cited this legacy issue, continuing until new car registrations pick up in sort of three to 4 years time. But the way that she was addressing it is that she was planning to shut down the site in April, and this was for three reasons really, because of the lack of demand for MOTs, but also to enable the 4-strong team there to have a well-deserved break, because they have been absolutely flat out for the last 12 months, and also to give her time to overhaul the workshop's maintenance schedule and just do some basics of housekeeping in the workshop. But this is a major issue for the sector, and she warned that there would be casualties because cash flow at this time in particular, will be a major issue for a lot of these businesses.
Yeah, and I think it's back to really even one of the earlier stories. It's this ramifications, this seasonality that is the pandemic has really thrown out of kilter now, hasn't it? With last March and last September's volumes, this March's volume's going to be down compared to a normal seasonal month. But actually, it's that impact in the used car market and that cycle going into the after sales, either through MOT and servicing and things like this, that is going to have impact for the foreseeable future, isn't it? And that's the challenge with some of this. So, again, one that we need to keep an eye on to see what the outcome is of that.
Yeah, so as we mentioned earlier, we have an acquisition. So this is now on a weekly basis, isn't it? We're covering an acquisition of some form or another. And we'll head over to AM Online for this. And the headline is, Virtue becomes Europe's biggest Honda dealer with Hepworth Huddersfield acquisition. Nice bit of alliteration in there as well. So this is Virtue is now Honda's biggest European partner. It has 14 sites with the acquisition of Hepworth Honda, and it does actually follow on from last year's acquisition of 12 BMW Mini and Motorrad sites from Inchcape. So it does show how acquisitive Virtue is, and its stated intention is to grow by acquisition.
You're right, and I think this is now we are going to get to that period, and there is appetite out there. I think there is appetite for partnerships and consolidation across the sector, and we'll start to see some of that. Honda is that key one, for Virtue to become a significant partner of Honda in the UK there. Great business there. He's a good friend of mine, is Stephen Brighton, and they've got a fantastic team at Hepworth, and Virtue have got themselves a good business there over in Huddersfield, and they are a business that nobody leaves. They've their employee, the service levels of employees is fantastic, and it's a fantastic family business. And Stephen is keeping their SsangYong business over in Keighley. It's a nice little profitable business there with used cars and SsangYong. I think it was a great move, and I think talking with Stephen Brighton, he knows the Virtue guys, he knows the operation that they run, he knows the business, and he did feel that he's handed it over to a great business, and he knows his team will be well looked after, and it's the right thing for that business over in Huddersfield to do. So I think you can see a little bit more of this starting to come now, can't you? So it's one that we'll be watching closely.
Yeah, and of course it's another acquisition for Virtue in Yorkshire, so they're really growing their footfall there. And linked to this story is a headline at Motor Trader, which is Macklin Motors debuts Motor Nation in Glasgow. So this is the opening of the new Motor Nation multi-mark used car business in Glasgow, following a £1.5 million investment in a new site.
No, and again, it's under the virtual ownership. And interestingly, if anybody did watch the car dealer interview with Govt and Robert Forrester, it was quite interesting. The discussion came out about keeping the Macklin name up in Scotland and not rebranding it, because as we know, Marshalls are all branded as Marshalls. But again, it goes back to our previous comment there with the appetite from Robert and the Virtue team for growth and investment. You know, they've always said that they've got acquisition plans and they've got growth plans, and I think they are sort of demonstrating that recently, aren't they, with that investment there and the previous acquisition of Hepworth.
Yes, and I think Macklin is a family name, isn't it? It's within the Forrester family there. So yes, they're sticking with it, and this is a particularly interesting move, and it sees them opening a site. It's near Macklin's Ford and Nissan dealerships in Darnley, and there's space there for 150 cars. So that's a reasonable size site there.
Yeah, exactly. And this week's and finally, so if anybody's been listening, and I wonder if you've guessed to who the Formula One driver is, but this is a story that you found in the Telegraph this week, Curtis.
It is, yeah, and the headline is Damon Hill admits he was sent on speed awareness course. So this came out of an interview he gave on the Joyride podcast, which is hosted by Jules Holland and Vic Reeves. I didn't realise there were other automotive podcasts, but there you go. And he actually said that he doesn't say when, but he was sent on 2 speed awareness courses. But with speed awareness courses, they do guarantee some form of anonymity. Yes. So when you go in, you're given a sticky label, apparently. So I found
it sounds like you're speaking from experience there, Curtis.
And you can write your name or nickname on it. So he chose to just write "The Champ" on his, but he said he was rumbled pretty quickly because everyone was sort of nudging each other and sort of looking in his direction.
Yeah, I can imagine he's probably not the first or the last. I suspect with these guys it's probably very difficult to keep their foot off the throttle in some cases, but I mean it's great for him to admit to it, and he's talking about a few things in the story, and it's worth heading over to the story because it's great to hear from these guys. I mean, we've had some losses to the industry this week, haven't we? Two sad losses to the sector. The automotive motorsport industry, but it's great to hear from these old champions and people within the sector. But so did you admit who you were then at the speed awareness course, Curtis? Or did you?
Well, I just put Phil Nothard on my label.
Is that when I got me banned? No, I didn't.
Yeah. Quite possibly, yes.
So no, I mean, again, all we'll say is head over to both the industry and the national headlines, that we've talked about there. Some very interesting stories, and like I say, we've had the Daily Express there. I think the MOT one is going to be very interesting as we start to move forward, and the impact of the seasonality impact that the sector's experienced through the pandemic and what that means to both businesses large and small in terms of cash flow and revenue seasonality that would normally be in place. I think we are clear that now we're starting to see that appetite for acquisition and partnership and consolidation that was in some cases delayed through the pandemic. I know there was some that took place, but it did obviously defer a lot that are now starting to take place. And, we are now getting close to the end of March. We'll be interested to start to see how March does close down down for the month and look forward to reopening of showrooms on the from the 5th of April up in Scotland, and if not before then, at least on the 12th of April in England, Wales and Ireland, as we know at the minute. So again, keep an eye on the headlines, and we'll keep trying to find the stories to share with you each week.
But that's all we've got time for this week. Many thanks for joining us for All the Chatter That Matters. You've been listening to the weekly Motor Trade Radio podcast, brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. We're back during the week with a special interview which will take a deep dive into the current and future car retailing trends with one of the sector's most respected commentators. More details on that on our social media channels and your podcast feed, so do look out for that one. Stay safe, stay well. Philip and I are back again next weekend for All the Chatter That Matters. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.